Yeah. This badge is He's ready. Started with the presentation. Thank you for coming. My name is Stewart. I'm with the State of Montana Natural Resource Damage Program, and we're talking about the draft natural resource damage assessment plan for the Columbia Falls Aluminum site. We have the captain background, our legal counsel for NRD, and then our Stark is with us too with the Confederated Salish tribes. There's a plan was prepared by a number of trustees, and I'll walk through each of those in a slide or two, but just before we get the hybrid meetings, we have people online as well as in the room. The meeting is being recorded, and we'll take questions at the end, but we just ask that you say your name before you ask your question and make your comment. And we are accepting written comments on the assessment plan. We're not accepting formal verbal comments tonight. Those were submitted, and we'll talk about that submitted at the end. Great, so the Columbia Falls Aluminum site has a number of different things and about the aluminum reduction plan.
I'm sorry, can you hear me? Because I'm on the phone and we can't hear anything you're saying. The sound is not working.
Okay.
It's garbled and impossible to understand. Are other people having that same problem on the phone?
Same problem on the on the site. Yes, it's all garbled.
Where did I'll try calling in on my phone and see if that.
That was a little better, Sydney, when you spoke a little closer, it seemed like.
Sorry to see. Did that help a little bit?
Yeah,
Yes.
I think if you're
Yes.
closer to the mic, yeah, perfect.
That helped a lot.
Okay, let me know if we need to change it anymore. Thanks for letting us know. Okay.
Can you tell us who's online with us?
Yeah, we can. So probably in the interest of time, I'll just go through it. We have Dick Sloan, DEQ, Adam Owen, who's an attorney, he represents Leonard. Nadia Martin, who's with Industrial Economics or NRD consultant. We have Cindy Rose, who's an attorney for Columbia Falls Aluminum Company. We have Rich Keelan, who's an engineer. Colby Gerke with Biohydrants. And then Tilbury was with Industrial Economics also. They consultants. We have
Once you move away from the microphone, no one on the phone can hear what you're saying.
Oh, you can't hear from even that distance. Sorry, just running through quickly everyone on the line. We won't step away so that it gets recorded. Jared, and I apologize. I'm sorry, Jared, I should understand how to pronounce your name. With Glencore and one of our admin staff.
Thank so there's kind of an example this drawing. So
I'm kind of having a little bit of a hard time understanding everything that you're saying, so.
Okay. Hey,
We move the chairs closer. Be helpful.
I guess I could.
Sorry.
I don't know how to.
Yeah, everyone can move closer. Sorry. Apologize, not use this space before we're burning it.
Yeah.
Close and cozy. And please sign in with our mailing list if you have not already.
Okay. We'll try again, see how the sound goes. So we're talking about the Columbia Falls aluminum site. I'm just going to refer to it as the CFAC site. This was an aluminum reduction plant operated from 1955 to 2009. The potentially responsible parties for the Superfund site are Columbia Falls Aluminum Company and Atlantic Richfield Company. And we, the trustees, have prepared a draft natural resource damage assessment plan that we'll be talking about tonight. We are accepting comment on the assessment plan. We were accepting comment through June 23rd, but we received a request to extend that. So we'll actually be accepting comment through July 23rd. And again, we're not accepting verbal comments tonight, but we're happy to do Q&A, and we just ask that you submit your comments in writing. So I'll talk about who we are, the trustees, and then go into a little bit of background on natural resource damages and the process that we follow. And then talk about the CFAC site, natural resources and services at the site, and then kind of the meat of the restoration plan, injury determination, injury quantification, and damage determination, as well as proposed assessment activities. And then we'll talk about the public comment period and how people can submit comments. So the plan was prepared by the Natural Resource Trustee Council. That includes us, the state of Montana. We're the Natural Resource Damage Program, and we work on behalf of the governor, who is the trustee for natural resources in the state of Montana. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes are also a trustee at this site. And again, Chris Stark is a technical expert with them. And then our federal partners are U.S. Department of the Interior, acting through Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then U.S. Department of Agriculture, acting through the Forest Service. And they couldn't join us tonight, but they are, I think, we don't have any partners online. But yeah, they were partners in preparing this and wanted to stay supportive of everything. And then, like Catherine said, online we have some people from industrial economics who are as our expert consultant that helped us prepare the draft plan. So under natural resource damage law, trustees can work under provisions in state and federal law. And these laws are CERCLA, probably better known as Superfund law. There's also a state equivalent of CERCLA, which is known as SECRA. And that's what the state of Montana is also operating under SECRA. And then we can also act under the Oil Pollution Act or OPA. It's not relevant to CFAC, but we do have oil spill sites around the state as well. These provisions allow trustees to recover damages for injuries to natural resources caused by the release of hazardous substances. And so a lot of what we do is kind of jargon heavy. So I'm going to jump into definitions on the next slide and we'll kind of come back to that. But once we recover damages or money for restoration, that money has to be used to restore, replace, rehabilitate, or acquire the equivalent of the injured resources. And the objective is to spend that money to try and return those resources to their baseline conditions. Baseline being the condition they would have been in if the release had never occurred. So we'll get a little more into it, but that's just kind of an overview. Just to define some of the terms that we use a lot, natural resources are public resources held in trust by a state, federal, or tribal entity. Examples are land, fish, wildlife, biota, air, water, any natural resources that everyone can use. We also can recover damages for injuries to natural resource services, and that's the physical and biological functions performed by a resource. So if we think of the Flathead River as being a surface water resource, it also provides services by being aquatic habitat or the service of recreational use like boating and floating. Similarly, groundwater is a resource. The use of groundwater as drinking water is a service provided by that resource. And then an injury is an observable or measurable adverse change in a natural resource or an impairment of the service. And we'll get a little more into that, like how we define an injury. And then damages, when we talk about damages, we're talking about a sum of money. So that's the amount of money that we determine is necessary to compensate for the injury. So just to go back to that first statement, trustees can recover damages for injuries to natural resources caused by the release of hazardous substances. And these damages must be used to restore, replace, rehabilitate, or acquire the equivalent of the injured resources or the services that they provide. So just hopefully that makes a little more sense having gone through some of these terms. And I also want to talk a little bit about remediation versus restoration, because I think a lot of people, if you're familiar with Superfund, you're probably more familiar with the cleanup side of it, which is the remediation. That is, it's related to what we work on, but it is a separate process. So the remediation is really aimed at implementing a cleanup that's protective of human health and the environment, whereas restoration is aimed at restoring or replacing the injured resources. And I think we have a graph that helps explain this. On the y-axis, we have resources or services provided by the resource, and then on the x-axis, we have time. So if you think of this as a water resource, before there's any release, that groundwater is of a certain quality. Maybe you can use it as drinking water, and it's here. And then when there's a release of a hazardous substance, it degrades that resource and it's not providing the same amount of services as it was before. It could continue this way, but generally in Superfund, EPA and DEQ will come in and implement response actions to clean up the site. And the goal of those response actions is to implement a risk-based cleanup. So they're looking at making sure that there's no risk posed by the contamination. Yeah, they're trying to make it protective of human health and the environment. So where the natural resource trustees come in is that residual. So what will it take to get the resources back to their baseline condition? And also the entire time that those resources were injured or weren't able to be used by the public, that's something that we can also recover damages for as trustees. And then just one other thing I wanted to mention for CFAC specifically, CERCLA was enacted in 1981, and so we can't recover for anything prior to 1981, but our baseline condition is set at that pre-release condition. So there's a release of a hazardous substance. There's the remedy. EPA and DEQ have certain phases and steps that they follow. This site has gone through a site investigation. They have a cleanup plan in the form of a record of decision or a ROD. I believe they're currently working on a consent decree or a CD. And after that, they'll implement the remedy. They'll fully design it and put it on the ground. What we have our own process that we follow, the natural resource damage assessment and restoration phases. So we have a pre-assessment phase, an assessment phase, and then a post-assessment phase. And I'll talk about each of these phases as we kind of step through the CFAC site. So just to go back to some background on CFAC, again, it was an aluminum reduction plant operated from 1955 to 2009. There's contamination on the site from spent pot liner, emissions of things like fluoride, hydrogen fluoride, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And then there's also contamination from on-site sludge ponds, landfills, leachate ponds, and percolation ponds. And the potentially responsible parties, again, are Columbia Falls Aluminum Company and Atlantic Richfield Company. So first, I'll talk about the pre-assessment phase. And this is meant to be a rapid review of readily available data so that the trustees can make a determination about whether it makes sense to move forward with an assessment. And we look at these conditions. I won't go through each one of them, but basically we're looking at, was there a release of a hazardous substance? Did it impact resources that are held in trust by one of the entities? And can we assess those damages at a reasonable cost? So in January of 2024, the trustees finalized our pre-assessment screen, and we determined that we were going to move forward with a formal assessment. So now we are in the assessment phase. And in this phase, we first develop an assessment plan, and that plan talks about how we are going to assess the injuries and quantify the damages. And most of the rest of the presentation will be about how we're going to do that. That plan has to go out for public comment. So that's the period we're in right now. We're in a 60-day public comment period. And then once we get public comment, we will incorporate those into the plan, and then we will conduct the assessment and implement what we've planned on doing. The assessment plan has three major components: injury determination, injury quantification, and damage determination. And we'll talk more about those soon. As far as the scope of the assessment, we have a spatial and a temporal scope. So spatial scope, we're looking at the 1,300 acres of the CFAC site, but we are also looking at anywhere that contamination from the site has come to be located. So that could be downstream of the site or otherwise down gradient of the site. So we're not really limited to that site boundary. We're looking at where the contamination is. And then temporally, again, we can't recover for anything before 1981. So we'll be looking at starting in 1981, what was the condition of those resources, and then looking forward into the future until they are restored to their baseline condition. And I'll talk more at the end about how we figure out what baseline is and how quickly those resources recover. There have been a number of hazardous substances identified at the site. These are contaminants of concern that we identified in the pre-assessment screen. This might not be an exact list. We could refine this list or we could expand this list. It just depends on what we find as we implement the assessment. But a number of inorganic compounds like cyanide, fluoride, arsenic, aluminum, and then also a number of organic compounds. So then we look, what natural resources are we looking at? We have kind of four categories of resources that we're focusing on. Surface water and sediments are lumped in there with surface water. We have the Flathead River just south of the site, and we also have Cedar Creek and the Cedar Creek Reservoir Overflow Ditch running along the site. There's also groundwater on the site, and this kind of hatched blue area represents the groundwater contamination on the site. So we'll look at that. Geologic resources, that is mostly soils that we'll be looking at contamination of, and then biological resources, which is any living organism, plants, birds, fish, wildlife, things like that. And again, in addition to the resources themselves, we look at the services that those resources provide. So for surface water, aquatic habitat, drinking water for wildlife, and recreation. There's a much larger description of services in the assessment plan. I just pulled out some of the easy ones to talk about. Groundwater can be used as drinking water. It can also be used for other municipal or commercial purposes. And then groundwater also can discharge to surface water. So it provides that service of recharging the surface water. Geologic resources, a lot of services there. Groundwater is stored in the soil. Groundwater gets filtered as it moves through the soil. Plants grow on the soil. People recreate on the soil. There's a lot of services that we can look at. And then biological resources, plants are a resource. Plants provide habitat for other resources. And looking at how contaminants move through the environment with services like a bug is a resource. It's also a food source for a fish. And then another component of the assessment are tribal cultural values. I'm not the expert here, but we have Chris with us to talk about the CSKT stuff. The tribes often have unique values and relationships with the resources. And so oftentimes when we assess injuries and losses, it's done differently for the general public than for the tribes. So that might look a little different. And specifically at this site, the tribes have the Hellgate Treaty, where they have reserved rights to hunting, gathering, and fishing, which within their usual and accustomed places, which includes the assessment area. So to get into kind of the weeds, I guess, in the assessment plan, we have the injury determination, quantification, and then damage determination. So I'll start with injury determination, and that's where we're establishing that there's a pathway and confirming exposure. So we have to show that the injuries have come from the site and from the hazardous substance releases there. So when we look at exposure pathways, there's a number of potential pathways on the site: airborne, stack emissions, also windblown dust, surface deposition, so putting waste directly into landfills, ponds, and storage areas. Leaching and runoff can move contaminants around the site. And then groundwater, again, discharging to surface water can move contaminants from one resource to another. And biological uptake, so animals ingesting contaminated media and then it moving through the food chain. There's certain criteria that have to be met in order for us to say there has been an injury. I'm not going to go through all of these. I certainly can if you guys have questions. But this is just kind of a summary of that criteria that we have to meet. And to give some examples, for surface water and groundwater, if there's an exceedance of a water quality standard, that is an injury. So we can move forward with that. We can also have documentation of measurable adverse changes in a resource. So for example, if you have manganese contamination in your water, there's no water quality standard for manganese, but it does turn your water black and smelly. And so that is an impairment of that resource. And then one other thing I wanted to highlight here for remedial injury, we can also recover damages for injuries that are like collateral injuries that are caused by the cleanup process. So if they go in and dig out contaminated soil, they're disturbing a lot of habitat. That's something that can be added into our injury. For injury quantification, so once we've determined that there is an injury, then we try to quantify it. So we measure the extent and we look at how much those services are reduced. So for extent of injury, we're looking at an area of habitat or a volume of groundwater, things like that. And then we're also looking at that degree of injury, like by how much were the services impaired. Baseline conditions can be hard at sites like this where the release started a long time ago. Ideally, we would have data pre-1955, but a lot of times we don't have that. So we might look at reference areas to figure out what might the site have looked like if there was never contamination there. We could also look at literature and we'll try to use different resources to establish what that baseline is. And then resource recoverability. So that's looking at how long is it going to take these resources to get back to that baseline condition. And if we have monitoring data that shows improvements, maybe we can extrapolate from that and say it's going to take X number of years for it to recover. Or we can look at literature or other similar sites to see what's happened there. And again, just to mention that tribal cultural losses, those can be assessed separately from losses for the general public due to that unique use of resources. All right, and then damage determination. So that's when we get into establishing what that dollar amount is. And damage determination is really focused on restoration. So we are looking at what's the cost associated with restoring the resources. There's a number of different valuation methods that we can use to come to that number. For this assessment plan, we have focused on equivalency analyses. So that's looking at injury as kind of a debit. You have a certain loss associated with that injury, and then looking at restoration actions that can provide you with a benefit or a credit and trying to balance the debit with the credit. And then we look at how much do those actions cost, and that would be our amount of damages. So we can do a habitat equivalency analysis for ecological damages, which looks at the habitat as a whole and all the services that it provides. We can also do resource-specific equivalency analysis. So for groundwater, we might look at specific, this volume of groundwater was injured, what does it cost to replace that much groundwater? And then we can also do additional resource-specific analyses if there are things like endangered species or something that we want to look at as a standalone resource. And then tribal cultural damages might have different methods, but again, it'll be based on what's the cost to restore those losses. Right. And then the last piece of the assessment plan is assessment activities. So we'll start with compiling and evaluating the existing data. You know, this is a Superfund site. There's been a lot of data collected there. So we will go through that and see what we can learn about the injuries to resources from what's already been collected. We might find some data gaps as we go through it. And so we've identified some potential data collection activities. It just depends on what we find once we are able to go through that data. And then we might need some cultural use assessment studies. That would be in addition to the more chemical contamination studies listed above. And then we'll get into the quantification of injury and damage determination that we just talked about. So what data we need, we'll dive into those next steps. So that's where we are right now in the assessment phase. I want to talk just a little bit about the next phase, which is a ways away, but just to give you an idea of where we're going. The post-assessment phase is where we actually do the restoration. So in the assessment phase, we look at what are the injuries, what will it take to restore them, and then once we have the damages recovered, we can start putting the money on the ground to restore the resources. Before we do any of that, we need to write the restoration plan, and that plan goes out for public comment. So before any money is spent, the public will have a chance to weigh in on what projects we're looking at. And I guess I kind of skipped a step. There will be a settlement agreement. That settlement will also go out for public comment, so people can weigh in on the amount of insurance. All right, so that's the summary I have of the assessment plan. We are again in the public comment period. We're accepting comments until July 23rd. And you can comment on whatever you want, but you know, we think people might be interested in the scope of the assessment and the injured resources. Are we looking at the right things, or did we miss something? Let us know. Also, the proposed approach that we have, those frequency analyses, does that make sense for determining damages? And then the last thing is restoration exemplar projects. So to do that damage determination, we need to look at potential restoration projects in order to balance the credits and debits. And it's best if we have local projects that have costs and benefits associated with them so that we can get a realistic idea of what it will actually cost to do that. So if anyone has restoration projects that I think would be a good fit, we'd be happy to hear those too. And then this is just information, how to submit comments. You can email them to us, nrdp@mt.gov. Please put CFAC draft assessment plan in the subject line. Sometimes we have multiple public comment periods open at once, and so we need to know which one it's for. You can also mail it to us if you want to. This is a link to the assessment plan, and then again, we'll take questions tonight, but we are not accepting formal comments. So if you want comments to be submitted formally and responded to, please do that in the meeting. And then there's contact information for myself and Catherine, and we can take some questions.
And we will post this on our website too.
Yeah.
We have one online, so I don't know if anyone can find a help with this one. What water quality standards are used in the injury determination process? Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'll move closer to the mic. We will look
Can you
at
repeat the question? Because we can't hear it on the phone.
what water quality standards will be used in the injury determination phase.
Thank you.
And so we will compare all of the contaminants that have a state of Montana water quality standard, which are referred to as the circular DEQ7 numeric water quality standards. We will compare them to those, whether it's a human health standard or a standard that protects aquatic life. And then, so that's for surface water, and then for groundwater, it would be only human health standards. And again, they're referred to as DEQ7 standards. So most contaminants we deal with have standards that the state has developed. If there's not a standard, then we look at, the EPA has developed other screening levels, but those get a little more complex, but primarily state of Montana water quality standards, whichever is lower, aquatic or human health.
I'll speak loudly.
I can repeat the question too.
There's a proposed development that is going to be adjacent to the Superfund site. I'm just wondering how, especially soils with all that disturbance, will be maintained and how we will prevent any further damage from that. Is that going to be discussed in the assessment or?
I don't think so. Oh, sorry. The question was if the assessment will address the development and contamination from the soils. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So we do have someone from DEQ online who may be able to speak to that, but I think primarily that would be more related to whether the cleanup is protective of the residential use. And so I think that would be something that EPA in consultation with DEQ would be looking at.
They didn't do an assessment on it for residential use during their period, so that's why we were trying to see if you all were gonna do some looking into it.
So there is some data for that available in the database, and do we actually? We could provide that figure, right? That sort of shows the soil information. We actually we did put all that onto it just to look at what the levels were. And so I think we had IEC kind of pull from the database just to see what the levels were, and we could put that up on our website if that would be helpful.
That would be great, thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that that you're able to look at problems caused by the remediation. And so I think one of the proposal involves hauling these substances away with trucks. And so is that on the list already of things that be considered to be evaluated?
I think we would, I'm assuming it's hard for people online to hear. So the question is, are we going to evaluate damages or injury due to hauling the waste away? So it will look at I believe the remedy they selected does not involve hauling. So we'll just look at the actual selected remedy and base it on that. So that would be the slurry wall and consolidation of on-site waste and the expected injuries from that.
And so do you look at the, so there's concern that the slurry wall might not work. And so there's kind of, I guess, they might have to do something other than what is currently planned. How does that fit into this process?
That is a good question. So yeah, the question is there's concern that the slurry wall might not work and there might need to be additional actions later. How does that feed into the injury and damage determination? And I don't know that I have an answer for you right now. I think that'll be one of the difficulties in assessing this site. If you have anything.
I mean, right now, we would be assessing it based on the selected remedy. And so we could update or amend the assessment if the remedy changed, but I'm not sure that we can speak to that right now, because right now we're just dealing with what's in EPA's proposed plan. So
Yeah, I wasn't clear on whether it's like, this is the one and done sort of opportunity or that need to reevaluate it, even if it's, 5 years, 10 years.
Well, these processes take time, and so I would anticipate, and not getting any information that they can't hear me, the assessment can be refined and amended as you're moving through the process and learn more information. Essentially, it's not sort of done and locked in unless there's a final court order or settlement that says we can't pursue a responsible party further. And so I think that it would typically, we would incorporate new information as we learn it. And I don't know how much that would affect the assessment though, since we haven't started it. I think if they just selected a different remedy, it may not change the assessment that much. I think it would kind of depend on how it played out.
So could I add on to that? So I'm still not clear whether this process continues on for the next 25 or 50 years. I mean, if the remediation plan does not, will you still be there to be assessing the damages and continue to hold the whatever it's called accountable?
So the question is if the remediation doesn't work after 25 or 50 years, will we still be there to determine the residual of the cleanup with our assessment, essentially hold the potentially responsible party accountable for that additional residual? I think is that a fair characterization? So this gets into really sort of, I'll do my best, okay? So if we were to complete the assessment, we'll have an assessment report that, quantifies the injuries and the damages, and that will be, we're trying to convert this injury into a dollar amount. And then the goal would be ideally to enter into settlement negotiations with the potentially responsible parties, or, potentially you can end up in court, which is natural resource damage cases don't typically end up in court. It's sort of Congress designed it to settle, but assuming we were able to agree upon a settlement, those often take years. And there is a portion of the settlement where the state, like one of the things that a responsible party gets in exchange for paying money is an agreement from the state that the state won't come after them. And so again, like basically a covenant not to sue. And so it would depend on, there's these very carefully worded, reopener clauses, they call them. And often it would be very difficult to go after them again. I'm not saying that it couldn't happen, but typically that's the benefit that a responsible party gets from settling with the state, is that they get certainty that they're not going to get sued. So it really would depend on the situation. Like if you had some catastrophic incident, maybe, but if it was just, the cleanup takes 5 years longer or something like that, it really would kind of depend on how it plays out. But that is sort of the benefit to, that's the thing that's offered to a responsible party for settling, is some certainty. And go ahead, Chris.
The Clark would be a good example how you can, even after 200 million is gone, come up with a scenario to pay for further cleanup or things that you didn't see.
Okay, so Chris with the CSKT said that the Clark Fork would be a good example of a scenario where you could come up with additional money if the cleanup funds weren't sufficient. So I do want to clarify that that is for the cleanup side of the Clark Fork. Typically, natural resource damage settlements are not structured that way, where there's, so the Clark Fork has what is referred to as a round robin, where all of the parties who entered into this settlement for cleanup have agreed that if the cleanup costs the state more, I can't remember, it's like 5 million, 10 million each party would pay to make sure the cleanup gets accomplished. Those are drafted that way because it addresses whether or not it's protective of human health and the environment. Typically, natural resource damage settlements are drafted that way. You get what you get and eventually just do the best you can with the funds that are available. And that's like really far in the future. I do want to emphasize that we are not in settlement negotiations with the potentially responsible parties. This is just sort of how this could play out, but right now we're going to do the best we can to assess and quantify the injury and try to make sure that it's complete as possible and makes the public whole and does the best we can to restore the resources. And so we will definitely be considering how long it takes the groundwater to recover, for example, or how how the selected remedy affects the resources, and we'll be looking at, the anticipated timeframes and things like that. So it is really an attempt to try to determine what the residual of the remedy is. We certainly are very invested in, good science and doing this thoughtfully and carefully and come up with a good assessment that's fair and accurate.
When the slurry wall designer was here, he said if the slurry wall, they'd have to put in like a special treatment. What's the lead time on that and who pays for that?
So I would say that is EPA in consultation with DEQ is responsible for the cleanup. And so I don't know if we know the answer to that question, but we would be happy. So the question was, we can relay this to EPA and DEQ and try to get a follow-up and post it on our website. The question for those online was, when the slurry wall designer was here, I'm assuming that was CFAC's consultant maybe, or EPA's consultant. When the slurry wall designer was here, they said that if the slurry wall didn't work, they would need to put in a treatment plant. And the question was, what's the lead time on that? And we don't know the answer to that, but we will check in with EPA and DEQ and we can post that. When we post this presentation on our website, we'll pass that along to them and try to get an answer.
So beside the lead time, who would be responsible?
Well, so typically I can't speak again, but for cleanups, the same potentially responsible parties have an obligation for cleanup as for natural resource damages. So when Sydney mentioned the Columbia Falls Aluminum Company and Atlantic Bridgefield Company, they are also the potentially responsible parties identified for the cleanup.
I have a series of questions. What statute gave rise to natural resource damage program?
What statute gave rise to our program, or for so we operate under the Federal and State Superfund and the Oil Pollution Act. And the original creation of our program was an executive order by the then governor in 1990.
Okay. And are you completely independent of any agency in government, in our state government? An agency that you report to, or you answer independently to a board in terms of?
So the question was, do we report to a state agency or a board or an elected official as far as process? And our office is administratively attached to the Department of Justice for purposes of like human resources and financial. But under the law, the governor is a natural resource trustee, and no governor in Montana has ever designated someone else as a natural resource trustee. So all of that decision-making authority remains and resides with the governor, and we only operate within the scope of what we are authorized to do. So we bring forward recommendations to the governor.
Appreciate that clarification. That's helpful. Can you give an example, 2 or 3 plans that you are either executing now or have completed and are monitoring?
So we can start, actually, Sydney can talk about, we just published a restoration plan up at Libby Asbestos. We settled for $18.5 million up there, and Sydney is currently implementing that plan. I don't know if you have specific questions about that. We also just published an amendment to our Anaconda restoration plan. All of our restoration plans are available on our website, and so we'd be happy to share them with
Any gold mines, for instance,
any gold mines.
because it's notorious.
Right, well, often in Montana, we don't recover natural resource damages typically if a company is just essentially, like when they go bankrupt, there's very little money left for natural resource damages. So I don't know if you're alluding to like Pegasus or something like that, but I'm not thinking of any, we have worked on former mining sites. I mean, the Upper Clark Fork River Basin obviously is the big one, but I can't think of any gold mines.
No,
So so there's two Superfund sites on Belt Creek, Carpenter Snow Creek and Barker Hughesville. We recovered a small amount of money for the Carpenter Snow Creek in a bankruptcy, in the Peabody bankruptcy, and and that's an orphan, basically a Superfund lead site that EPA is working on. So we recovered a small amount in a bankruptcy. We don't know what to do with $1.2 million for. And then Barker Hughesville, we just issued a notice of intent to doe run, and the other responsible parties up there. So potentially responsible.
Another question has to do with your sources. Because to complete these tasks requires a lot of expertise. And expertise costs money, whether it's in-house or. So what are the sources of your department program?
So the question was, what's the source of funding for the natural resource damage program? We have, Governor Gianforte put $1 million to pursue new claims in the 2023 budget. And then, again, House Bill 2 included another $1 million. And so, we have substantial expertise in-house with our natural resource trustees that we work with. And so we do as much in-house as possible. And then, we are paying a consultant to help us with this. Luckily at this site, there is a significant amount of cleanup response data. And so, there may be data gaps that need to be filled, but there is a pretty robust database that we will start with.
An answer to the question that I had regarding funding, is any of that federal funding?
We don't have any federal funding. All right now that I'm referring to is through the state of Montana. So there is a federal source of funding, but none of that has been brought to bear on this site. And I don't know if it ever will be. And then I can let Chris answer as to, obviously the Confederated Salish and Cootie tribes has, in-house expertise. I don't know.
And you reached settlements in some cases. Have you had to?
So our program, way prior to my time, but it was formed in 1990 to pursue the state of Montana's litigation against Atlantic Richfield in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin. And so, yes, the state of Montana actually is in treatises on natural resource damages because it's fairly unusual to end up in court, and we have gone to court, but it's really not designed for that. The Congress really did intend for, that's why there's this fairly methodical process to.
I appreciate that. I think that's important.
Oh, you're welcome. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you had a follow-up question. Okay, I mean, take your time. We're here as long as anyone wants us to be here and stuff. You wanna? Okay. All right, with the limitation of only being able to assess conditions as far back as 1981, how will events such as major floods that occurred in the 1960s be evaluated? Will they be ignored outright, or will there be a special consideration? And so I will answer this briefly, but it may be more of a Sydney question. So the fact that a major flood may have spread contamination doesn't, so the prohibition on injuries that occurred fully before 1981 really refers more to contamination that occurred and was cleaned up prior to 1981. If the contamination was spread partially due to a flood prior to 1981, but the injury continues to occur past 1981 and the contamination continues to migrate, then it would be part of, I guess, the conceptual site model of the site. It'd be part of the pathway determination. Is that so?
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure if that. Yeah, I don't know if Nadia or Topher would like to weigh in on that one.
Yeah, can you hear us? Catherine, this is
Yep.
Nadia. Yeah, I think you've got it right. I mean, it's really if the flood caused that sort of remobilization of contamination and that's affecting resources post 1981, that certainly would be sort of a factor in the assessment. So I think you hit it right on. I know, Sydney, if you were going to add to that.
Yeah, and I would add that obviously, as many of us know, there was a huge flood in 1908, and that's a pretty important part of how contamination was spread in the Upper Clark Brook River Basin. And certainly the fact that it occurred prior to 1981 didn't end up reducing how we viewed that contamination. Yeah, go ahead.
Are there any contingencies, short, that would have to be very quickly dealt with if we had an incident like happened on the Yellowstone River a couple years ago, through this area? Does that wipe out the slurry wall and all the containment ponds and everything? It's all washed in and you start to scratch. That's my impression.
What
So
was the
if-
question?
The question was if there was a huge flood like the 2022 Yellowstone River flood, and that takes out the slurry wall, are there contingencies? And I would say we'll listen to this recording and try to make sure we pass along the questions to EPA and DEQ. That's the kind of thing that would typically be addressed as part of your cleanup, that EPA would, whether they come in on an emergency basis and, work with the responsible parties to make sure that that gets addressed. They wouldn't just, I mean, I can't speak for them, but just from our experience, seeing how EPA and DEQ respond to emergency releases like that, they would respond to that. It wouldn't just be ignored.
Yeah, again, we're not in charge of
Yeah.
that. But typically when you have long-term remedies like that, even if they've stopped work on it, they continue monitoring to make sure that it's effective and acting how they expect it to. And so if something goes wrong, they can come back and fix it. Yeah.
We'll pass this along to EPA and DEQ, though it does sound like there's definitely some interest in follow-up, and they were very gracious and spread the word about our meeting, so we will make sure that we note down the questions and request some follow-up. It does sound like there's some interest in that, so we certainly will pass it along.
I have just one more question. I'm sorry we came a bit late, but you may have answered. How are the trustees that you were to appointed? Trustees?
That's, I think, a legal question.
Sure.
How do trustees become trustees, kind of, to summarize?
So there's, as Sydney mentioned at the beginning of the slides, we are working with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. They are a trustee because of their treaty rights. And so, they So that makes sense to you. The Department of Interior is also working with us through the Fish and Wildlife Service primarily, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but that's solely related to the CSKT. But the Fish and Wildlife Service is related to migratory birds and endangered and threatened species. And then the Forest Service has Forest Service land on Tea Kettle Mountain and extending from there. And then the individual trustees are appointed by those federal agencies. The governor, the state of Montana's trustee, that's actually in the law, in federal law. And since typically in Montana, the governor appoints him or herself as a trustee.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So there's one state appointed person for federal, and that's that are going to be seconded.
So there's the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, and yes, and then the two, so the question was, there's one state appointed official, and then the two federal, and then the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, and correct, and it's a collaborative process, but yes, the governor is the natural resource trustee in Montana.
But we would assess, we are in charge of assessing state resources, and the federal partners are in charge of assessing federal resources.
Right, and the state of Montana has basically all of the resources essentially, and then there's some overlap, obviously, with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, so we'll be working together with them, and same overlap with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So basically every resource, the state also has some interest.
Okay. I have a question I'd like to follow up with this gentleman. He was asking about the resources to put this plan together. It was your names are on it, so I'm assuming it's your plan. Could you tell us who else inputted to this plan?
Yes, so
Typically, and
right, so the state of Montana, we have a natural resource damage assessment consultant. They're on line industrial economics. And then we have worked with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service technical staff to finalize it.
have you ladies, no, I'm getting clear. Have you ladies been on that site yet? Or no? So you've had a chance to walk the entire site?
Yes, Columbia Falls Women Company very graciously let us do that. I appreciate it.
In terms of, I had like 20 minutes before I came here to review your document. And I can't, when your statement was, and I just started reading it, and I was curious where the information came that's in it, because there is a lot of information in there, but some of it is contradictory to what the federal government put in their plan, their final plan, mitigating it. And I'm curious who else would put information in there. I assume that would be your own source, but obviously you are looking at something that they did look at. Is there?
So all of our resources and references that we cited in the plan are available upon request. It's a huge folder, so we have to send it to you through our FTP site, but we would be happy to share with you everything that we relied upon.
There's an FTP, just some kind of like an AI for federal government and everything, you know.
Well, it's the way that the state of Montana can transfer folders that are too big to email.
Okay.
And so we would be happy, anyone who would like that, we would be happy to share it.
Just pick pieces and parts that pertain. When you're looking at this, is there anything that you've identified as something that is probably going to be a problem, okay, that should be looked at further, just from what you've obviously done several of these. Is there anything that you guys have seen already that says that's my problem? I'd like to know upfront if there's anything that triggers your intended.
So before I answer that question, I also wanted to comment on something you said. We didn't intend anything in our assessment plan to be contradictory from what EPA has said. We relied upon a lot of their data. It's just getting back to that picture that Sydney put up there that shows the difference between, like, remedy is supposed to be protective of human health and the environment. Its job isn't to bring it back to baseline. That's where we come in. And so it's almost like two halves of a puzzle, rather than being contradictory. It's just two different purposes of super. And then I guess our pre-assessment screen is probably the best place to start if you want to know where we sort of initially saw the likelihood that there was an injury. It was based on cleanup data. There's clearly exceedances of water quality standards in the groundwater. I mean, that's sort of readily apparent from looking at the data.
The water quality standard deviations. The most of actually.
Well, that will be the purpose of the assessment, is we'll look more closely at other impacts, the groundwater, surface water interaction, the results of the removal action of that pond that was in the channel of the Flathead River, that type of thing. So we'll be looking at, it's going to be a comprehensive assessment.
The federal government didn't do a PFAS assessment of that site. And even though they were getting ready to force people to spend millions of dollars on their water system, Kalispell being an example. They're going to look at PFAS for that site, the soils in detail.
That is an excellent question. We would love to, if you have comments like that, we would love to hear that kind of thing.
Say that PFAS would be modern in the chemistry business. Polyfluoro keel substances, okay? So it's chlorine, all the organic carbon chains and so on. The aluminum plant used an extreme amount of fluorine as a solvent out there for making aluminum. And all of the containment vessels are made of carbon. The chemicals that were in those carbon, the pitchfork that makes up the amp has 10,000 different organic chemicals. You see on the one slide there, they're talking about problems with PCBs. PCF is polyfluoro. There's thousands of them out. Whether or not they're in the PFAS categories, it never came up. But that site should have had literally millions of pounds of those types of things dumped out there in the air for over 55 years. And I think that needs to be cleaned up. And super pump isn't doing it. If you guys find it, you go after them, you clean up all the millions of pounds of chlorine been available to produce those chemicals. Those are fluorine, they last a short period of time. You combine them with the organics and they're lifetime chemicals plus. So they got to still be there because the chemistry we use at 1,000 degrees centigrade, you make PFAS and you make a lot of it.
So I'm sorry for the folks online. The question was whether we are assessing PFAS, and also related to that the stating that the cleanup should look at PFAS, which we'll add this to our list of passing it on to EPA and DEQ. I would note that there is a process under the cleanup side of this that is called a 5-year review, where EPA comes back and looks at their remedy. And so I would also keep that in mind for them, but we will pass that along, and then we will certainly, I mean, that's, I think, really,
that they're not interested. Okay, they don't want to go back and look at that. I don't think. Second question, wait.
Go ahead. Oh, well, my measures has been addressed already, but how often when you're doing the monitoring, how often are those results published to the public? How does the public know what is happening with the line?
so the natural resource damage program isn't yet we haven't done any sampling. The assessment that we're in right now is a necessary step prior to sampling, but we have compiled a database both from data we got from Glencore, Columbia Falls Aluminum Company, and some other DEQ sources, and we put it all into one database. And we put Excel spreadsheets that you can sort and you can look at. And it's on our website, and we would be happy to, that's as of September of last year. And so what we have is available to anyone. I don't know the answer. We'll add that to the EPA DEQ list I'm sure it's probably on EPA's website, but I'm not an expert on where to find it. So we will.
Well, as a department, the state, you're subject to freedom of information and it's obviously well.
Yep. We are subject to information, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's the easiest way to find it. If you go to our website where we post all of our information requests, the database is there. If you have a hard time finding it, you can contact either one of us. I'm happy to share it. And also the references that every document we relied upon for this assessment plan is available, and we would be happy to share it.
I have a few questions. First of all, going back to the development thing, and let me know if this is better to submit for written comment. Is there gonna be any future damages identified that would potentially affect future residents of that development? And if so, what's the recourse gonna be for that? Is there recourse in the assessment? Is that an EPA question?
So, repeating the question, asking if there will be future damages identified for the future residents of the property when it's developed for residential. So, that is definitely an EPA DEQ question. They do have some data. They'll put that figure. We plotted it just to look as part of when we were looking, just kind of preliminary review of the information. We're happy to put that up on our website. They have collected that data. I'm not a risk assessor, but they definitely, that is part of the job of remedy. It is identifying a protective cleanup. And I think when we looked at it, there weren't obvious exceeds of the human health standards, but I just want to just put it up on our.
Okay, thank you. My next question was, one of the main Columbia Falls drinking water wells will sit next to that proposed development. So again, might be an EPA question, but, are they gonna do any testing for that in the groundwater and to ensure that those contaminants are not being sucked in? And how would that relate to a potential expansion of the city?
Yes, I think, again, that would fall more under EPA and DEQ, but, I believe they do monitor all city wells. And I think those results are available on EPA's website for the site. I don't think they've seen any contamination in any of the city wells. You know, they have the plume delineated, pretty well, I think, yeah, so, and that's definitely something as far as being protective of human health that they look out for. Is the plume migrating? Are wells in danger of becoming newly contaminated? But, yeah, that would be more EPA and DEQ.
I think what we're gonna do, so the question was, Columbia Falls City well being next to the site and next to the residential development. I'm thinking that we will compile all of these and ask EPA if they can maybe do like respond to them, push it out for their mailing list, and then we can forward it to our mailing list or something, because it does sound like there's a lot of questions about the remedy, and we definitely don't want to speak for EPA, but we also don't want to leave people feeling like they don't have the right information. So we'll make sure that we reach out to DEQ and EPA and try to make sure that these questions are answered. But I would say when I worked at DEQ a long time ago, that was like a top priority for the cleanup agencies, is making sure that drinking water doesn't have contamination above the standards. And so we will pass it along and make sure we get a good answer.
Thank you.
What's the time frame for
the Mexicans? Like, how long will it take to get you? The damage, like, what was it called? I'm sorry, I'm drawing like, the,
Full assessment.
yeah, how long does it take? I mean, right now, you take public comment, do you think like within the year you might have a damage assessment? Draft, I guess?
Yeah,
Do you have?
so the question is, do we have an idea of a timeline, how long it might take to finalize the assessment plan and then implement the assessment and come to a dollar amount, I think? That's a really hard question to answer, especially on this site where we're working with multiple trustees. You know, we have state government, tribal government, federal government, all trying to work together. And we just don't know the scope of the assessment yet, or we don't know if there's data gaps that we need to fill. So I think there's a lot of unknowns. As far as getting to the point where we have money to put on the ground, I think we're pretty far away.
Yeah, as far as at least 5 years, we put together sort of a table of our settlements for the legislature a little while ago, and it was sort of striking to look at just these, you know, I guess good science takes time. It takes time to make sure that we get it right. It also takes time then to, if we are going to negotiate with a potentially responsible party, you know, that takes time. The only time it's been more compressed than 5 years, honestly, has been in like a bankruptcy context, which I think we're all hopeful it's not gonna happen in this case.
And then, you ever done a remedy where it's like, because it seems like this land is not gonna get restored to anything that would have set aside the algae tree. So is it always cash? Or can it be like, you know, we'll buy you this habitat here, say to the tribes, that nature?
So the question was, is it always cash or do we sometimes do a land swap? And yes, the short answer is that the state has often settled to get land as a part of its settlement. That happened in the Upper Clark River Basin, Atlantic Richfield. It happened in the Asarco bankruptcy. We got 232 acres that created a very nice park in East Helena along River Creek. It is. I mean, I have no idea here because we haven't gone through the assessment, but yes, to answer your question, that's something we've definitely done.
We have had a question online for a while.
No.
So I'll just do that one. Do you have any information you can share about why consolidating and keeping waste in place is appropriate at CFAC while it was deemed necessary to remove waste to an offsite landfill at the Milltown Dam site? And I think that again would be a question for EPA and DEQ. They're looking at a protective remedy. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but we can pass that along.
Yeah, well, we see. So I think some of that's outlined in the recording decision, and they have some listed waste there, which is like a hazardous waste. But we'll add that to the list, and we'll make sure that we try to clearly pass these along to get answers back from EPA and DEQ.
And Adam Cohen has his hand raised. If you want to go ahead and ask your question, Adam.
Yeah, I wasn't able to get the chat to work. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Just two questions. One, there was some discussion of funding earlier. Has NRDP prepared any kind of cost estimate or budget for what you think this assessment will cost? That's one question. And the other, are you working with an economist? And if so, can you say who that is?
So we haven't yet budgeted for implementation. Our first step will be reviewing the existing data. And so we will be developing that as part of our contract with industrial economics. And I will if we work with an economist, that would be with IEC. And I don't know if Nadia wants to speak to that or if that's been identified yet, or I don't.
Sure, yeah, Catherine, this is Nadia. We have several scientists and economists that work in the field of natural resource damage assessment and have for several decades. So we can, we certainly draw on those individuals as needed, depending on the needs of the assessment. I don't know that I would name a singular person at this stage. But if hopefully that answers your question, we definitely have, several economists that work in this field, as well as scientists.
And I'll add, we don't have our federal partners here today, but they do at times bring in-house economists. So I don't know if they'll do that or not, but it's a possibility.
Yes, that's a good point. The DOI always assigns an economist to the case.
Water ownership. Chris's employer took over complete ownership of the water rights for plant water, which was used, okay? Are you guys capable of using monies that you have to restore 3 to 7 million gallons of water per day usage to the people of the tribe? Yeah, the state has, we understand the lawyers ruling up to 125 acre feet. If we get to keep it, the state regulates it. Above that, it belongs to them. Is it their decision now that they can go back to 1981 and say we want, whatever an acre foot of water's worth from 1981 to 2009, and we want it for 3 to 7 million gallons a day. That's between 10 and 25 acre feet of water a day. It's going to be millions of dollars.
So the question was the CSKT water rights related, is that related to the Milton water rights? Yeah, and I would like to kick that, I'm thinking Chris might need to take that back to his team and answer that question. Or do you feel comfortable answering?
Easy enough. The Milton water rights is a water right to use for natural resources. So we can't sell it.
And so you use the water right there to make money. And fishing and recreation and everything else. There's a lot of good water.
There are certainly ancillary things. The water itself, those rights are for putting the water in there to raise those fish, to have those natural resources. You don't get to keep the water. Everything that flows into the lake goes away. There are monies to be made while it's here, recreation, et cetera, just like everybody else. But we don't actually own water per se. For instance, on the Hungry Horse Dam, there's a fair amount of water on the top of that. That gets thrown into the lake. Everybody gets to use it, and then it goes out of the lake. Tribe does get to generate some electricity, but so do the farmers in the Washington, they get to suck it out. So everybody gets to use that water. So the right to use it in place at a time, that is the right.
So we do have a right to build back with the people.
Yeah,
that didn't get to use.
Yeah, I've never heard anybody in the legal department or the council mention, hey, let's go back and do that. That's really bad social justice in my opinion. Well, it wouldn't, I don't know. It's just not right for us to do that. That's the thing. Well, so far, so good. You never know that.
Thank you.
So you've mentioned that you'll be looking for data gaps. And I think Nino mentioned one of them that you responded to, saying that you'd be doing some that as far as CFAC is concerned. But I'm wondering that who will be you're going to be looking at the EPA data. Who will be recognizing data gaps, and what will you do about those gaps? And an additional question is then, for some of us who have either been employed years out there or have done considerable research in the last couple of years on all of this data and have identified some gaps. will you be responsive, will you welcome us pointing that out and be responsive to what we have to say?
Sure. So just to repeat the question, who is looking for data gaps?
What will you do about it?
What are we gonna do about them? And then if other people in the community have identified data gaps, will we be receptive to that information? And I think, so I'll hit your second point first. Yes, if you have information, if you have thoughts and things you think we've missed or data gaps you already know, like please submit them as comments. We'd love to hear them. And then we can follow up and pull people in to help provide information. That's great. You know, we're based in Helena. We've got our partners based in other places. We need help from the community to know what we're missing. Who's doing the data gaps analysis? Yeah, that will be a collaboration between the trustees, our technical and legal team, and then industrial economics. And I don't know, Nadia, they'll be leading it up. Nadia, do you want to talk about who's gonna do that?
Sure. Sure, happy to. So yeah, I guess I missed a little bit of the beginning about how you introduced us, Catherine and Sydney, but since I'm answering a few questions here, I'll just introduce myself real quick. So I'm Nadia Martin. I'm a principal at IEC, or Industrial Economics, as Sydney mentioned, and I lead our technical support for the state here and for the rest of the trustees in this assessment. So, you know, I myself, along with my team of scientists and economists, will be helping support as needed, you know, as the trustees need any technical support in working through this assessment and identifying those data gaps that Sydney was talking about, and talking through from, you know, with the group on the options for addressing those data gaps. And there are usually several options to answer the question about sort of how you address data gaps. You know, one of the options is to collect additional data, and I think that was mentioned earlier about, you know, potential sampling data that the natural resource damage assessment, you know, might lead to. So there's certainly that as an option for the trustees to consider. Other options might be, you know, reasonable assumptions based on the existing information, and thinking about the best way maybe to reasonably assess what those, you know, how to fill those data gaps or how to address them in the context of the assessment, if that helps. So there's sort of multiple options, and I think it's something that the group will just be considering as we move forward, depending on the needs of the assessment, you know, considering all the other cost and time and all of those things as well. Does that help, Sydney and Catherine?
Yep. And we welcome comments, and that's exactly what we would love to have. Written comments on the NRDP, you know. Just to reiterate for everyone that this is the question and answer, which we really appreciate. It's very robust, but we're not going to take these as like formal telephone. We would welcome restating these types of.
Give you this. In 2020, they jammed through rerouting almost the north bank of the planet. Okay, and your document claims that, and correctly show that they're supposed to put it back against the original channel along with the bank and all these. Okay, that what they did is safety measure, and the county knows it, state of Montana knows it, so it's CFAC, they won't let anything about. What they did was they went halfway down the island, and they left it. Sure, it's higher than the river. So when it floods in there, it acts like a dam, and it's rerouting the route, cutting off the part of that island that has all the biological problems for the invertebrates and all that. I don't know if that was done intentionally or not. But when it's done in 3 years, it's creating safety measures for rats, especially right now, because you're floating into forest that's gone since 1964, from where they left that road to the end of the island. Okay, somebody needs to fix that. Okay, they refuse to, you know, I've been waiting for 3 months for EPA engineer, haven't seen yet, spoken to him several times now, but they know what's wrong, they just don't want to do it. So there's an hazard, I don't know if there's any, monetary or whatever, but now they'll get to do what they're supposed to do as their 2020 leading up to the shot. They didn't do what they told you, their document says when they're gonna just like over it, and it's still not right, it's just, we could see it together. Okay.
So the question was related to the removal action of the south ponds in the north channel of the Flathead River in 2020. Noted that it's a safety hazard. It wasn't fully, the ponds weren't fully removed is your question, and what's
They
being
didn't.
done? Yeah.
They put the river back, they shouldn't have. And it's waiting for it to see,
So if that is related to the response action, if there are injuries related to a response action, then that is something that can be assessed as part of the natural resource damages. If also.
Doesn't really give somebody keeps around and with their family and top person full of debris. Yeah, it's stupid to leave it there, so. I showed you guys to put pressure on whoever was responsible to do the job that they said or publicly.
So we will add this to our list for EPA and DEQ, but I do want to say that it will be part of the assessments, looking at what's there. And so,
Sorry, I just need to say, like, remembering that the services provided by those resources includes recreation, and so if it has impacted the recreational experience on the Flathead River, that's something we will look at as well. And I would just encourage you to expand this.
yeah. And we will do our best. We're going to go through you and Erin, because I'm sure very excited to help us. Are going to be compiling a lot of things we want to pass to EPA and DEQ. So, yes, go ahead.
When should we expect the presentation on the website? Not necessarily all the questions and answers.
So Erin, the question is when we can expect the presentation on the website. Since you're responsible for that, do you want to let us know when you think you might be able to do that?
Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, can you repeat the question? Sorry, I was grabbing water.
Oh, that's fine. Erin, the question was when we can put the presentation on our website.
Usually Jody does that, but I can do it as soon as, I think she has to do it because she has the authority on the meeting itself. But we can get it up there tomorrow.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Erin.
You're welcome.
I have to put you on the spot. Go ahead.
So I'm very interested in this, the natural resource damage, which is public property, public damage, but why is damage to private citizens or private entities not included in this? Like, land rentals or.
Great. So, this is the great. I'll try to be as simple about it as. Oh, sorry. The question was, we're presenting on natural resource damages for injuries to public resources, but why aren't injuries to private resources covered? And the short answer is because of the way that Superfund was written, the trustees, so in our case, the governor, only can recover for the public resources that are held in trust. And it comes from, English common law on the idea that we all share these resources, and since nobody owns them, someone has to be able to recover on behalf of the public. And so that's what the governor does for the surface water and the groundwater. It doesn't prohibit other people from, if you otherwise had a basis for covering damages, I mean, that would be outside of the scope of my area of expertise, but the governor can't recover for private economic damages. And there's just a lot of case law on that makes it really clear that these are like two separate causes of action. So, But we recover, the state of Montana recovers for something that other folks couldn't. And that's kind of how you think the distinction, like something that nobody owns and everybody owns, that's what we recover.
I'd like to ask for all on it because aluminum, and this is private property, so it's probably outside of it, but like you guys consider it because the cost for the adjacent community should is all those homes and properties between the North Fork Road and the area in the west side of it, okay? The guy that, and Glencore did this situation, they sold the property. And so they sold 2,400 acres. He's out there developing it now. And the city or the county, somebody's going to force us to get rid of our wells and our septic systems, okay? Because he's already got a plan on bringing Stewart on there for 2,400 acres. Collins gonna need a fairly good site development thing, okay? So we are being, taken advantage of it, forced to pay, $20,000-$30,000 per lot, probably, to get city sewer and water. That is a going forward damage that the city, they knew it was going to happen. And EPA, when they did their final analysis, answered people's questions, they just not our concern. Okay. Bottom line is, what do? You take up arms and go after the city and say, you can't put your sewer line through our property. We'll blow it up every 3 weeks to make it in. Or, I mean, it's nuts. It's something that we knew was going to happen if he bought that property. And, we don't want to pay for his development. That's one part of it. So is that a damage that, somehow can fit underneath your umbrella? The other thing is, they allow them, they do this to buy a game range, winter game range for the animals in the Glacier Park. Often can get them in Columbia and in winter. People on the other side of the river, from the city for putting sewer across the river, okay, for good reason. One of the things they used was it was a migration corridor for the elk and the deer going into the Central Valley. Okay, so the home of all those deer in the winter sits between Aluminum City and Tea Kettle Pond. Tea Kettle Pond is a natural wildlife refuge. All right. Okay. So they intentionally sold it to somebody that they knew was going to destroy it. And even us, for the last 3-4 weeks, we've had smoke every day. They're burning the tiles. There's 3 big forests that are sitting just on our boundary going back. He's cut every tree down. They're digging roads in. They're hauling logs up probably about 100, 150 log trucks. For the last 3 weeks, and we've got dust off. They're destroying the road that the county owns in the city. Now he's got his lawyers trying to block that to basically have the county vacated so that that road no longer exists. And it's been there since the 1930s. Somewhere in there. So, Chris's idea of swapping land, that would be a good time to get after it. Take that winter range, swap that for something else that we can destroy. And they never should have been able to sell it to it because they knew the people's feelings. They did not want that thing turned into houses, and let alone not just 2,400 acres all contingent located right there. So is there a damage being done there?
Because we tried to tie again, wildlife farm through there to the river.
Yeah, when we're still on the other side of the river, 100 acres, been a conservation easement for wildlife. Here it is that they swim the river back and forth at night to go and feed out there, but they live during the day on he said one. Okay, so yes, there is a damage, yeah, maybe the gentleman from Salish can almost with the wildlife park or the fish and game through their village, you know, what we have out there with that pond and stuff, people that are destroying something that has great value to the people of the stuff. Okay, that's a public thing.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to do my best to try to summarize that for the folks online. So your first comment or question was related to the fact that you're concerned that you're in aluminum city, that you're going to be annexed into the city and have to, or it's being, sorry, it's going to, you are being annexed into the city and won't be able to use your septic in your well, is your concern. That was the first sort of comment, and I would say that the work we do is related to covering for damages related to hazardous substances. So if you were in a situation where you no longer could use your well because it was unsafe, then the groundwater, one of the services that the groundwater provides is drinking water. So if it were that were the cause, then that, you know, that would be something that we would assess. We, you know, changing development patterns, I'm sorry, it sounds like a lot to unpack, and I'm really sorry. To answer your first part of your question, the annexation into the city is not the type of injury that we would assess.
About destroying a wildlife, the winter range.
So we would, if it's on private property, the actual like private property itself is not something that we would assess injury to. There are like groundwater underneath the private property, it is a public resource. The, you know, the public habitat, the wildlife that use Teakettle Mountain, that's a state resource, the wildlife themselves, but we have no, under Superfund, although the cleanup part can address what's done on private property, we don't have, you know, if someone voluntarily changes the use of their property, like a redevelopment, we don't have basically like that's not really our job. Sorry, I didn't mean that like it sounds, I'm sorry, it sounds bad, but it's not something that we have the authority to.
Really, problems like that, really.
I mean, it is a patchwork of different regulatory authorities, and it's not, we don't have any authority to tell, you know, people how to develop their plan.
So to go along with that, if I can get my thoughts in order here. Now that 2,400 acres is no longer owned by CFAC. That if CFAC still owned that 2,400 acres, would this be with the black, if they were destroying the wildlife corridor, would you be able to address that?
So the question is, if CFAC still owned that property, would we address the changing development? And the answer is no. The natural resource damage assessment process isn't intended to control how people develop their property. It's related to making sure that the public's made whole from impacts from the hazardous substances from their operations. And so if you know, the city chooses to approve that development, the EQ and EPA say it's protected, like that, those are the agencies that are involved in that. We have no involvement in a private property owner choose to sell or not sell or develop or not develop.
We need to follow up to that. Bottom line, let's say, you know, the subdivision now. Joe Love, digging my bag and start to dig up. It's not going for this. That all in this man, that all in.
So the question is, if the homeowner digs up a 55-gallon drum of contaminated materials, it would most immediately be addressed by EPA or DEQ, depending on if it's a federal Superfund site or not. One of those two agencies is, responding to make sure that it's protected. If it were contaminating groundwater, it might be part of a bigger natural resource damage claim or something like that.
Is the developer NRDP liable? If he bought everything, but I'm curious. They seem to be addressed.
So the developer for our purposes, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, is he inherited from liability? Or is he essentially responsible?
So,
You know,
right, those are the two identified potentially responsible parties if they owned or operated at the time of the contamination. We will reevaluate, if there is additional potentially responsible parties before we're to enter into a settlement. I'm not familiar with that transaction, but my guess would be that they took the steps they needed to be a bona fide prospective purchaser. I had to guess. I don't know. And so if,
I think it's very important, which would be that.
so if I want to make clear that I'm not familiar with what they did, but there is a procedure under Superfund that allows for a purchaser of a property to take certain steps to protect themselves from liability. So I don't know if they did that, but it's called bona fide prospective purchaser protections. We would evaluate that before we entered into it. Comprehensive settlement negotiations, we will reevaluate to make sure that we can identify the potentially responsible parties.
The next question, then change to Chris's question, is it biodegradable? Is it entirely biodegradable?
So the question is it entirely biodegradable? And I don't know. I think that's one that we will add on to the EPA DEQ. That's their job, is to make sure that the remedy is protective, regardless of who develops it and who sells it. They are going to hopefully continue to make sure that it remains protective of human health. And that's their job, and we will make sure that we add that to the questions.
I'd like to make one comment at this point. You've been very patient answering your questions. I have never been in the public meeting that has so faithfully rephrased questions so that everybody knows what they're talking about. And I thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. So I feel embarrassed to repeat this. I was just calling meaty bird, it was being praised so faithfully that everyone understands the question. So I will just pat myself on the back and appreciate that. So thank you, sir. I really appreciate that. Any other questions? I mean, and Cindy and I, our contracts here, we welcome, if you have phone calls, we will do our best to reach out to the EPA and DEQ with the questions and work with them to make sure that answers are distributed. We'll put the, as Aaron mentioned, we'll get this up on our website. Obviously we're recording this, so that will I'm not sure probably that, but I don't know the mechanics of that, but we are an open book. Anything that we have that it is not private information that we're not allowed to share, which we don't have anything for this site, but if we were, we will share whatever we're allowed to understand on.
So I just have to make a statement, not a question. And that is that I think that it's a real shame that damages, that it only goes back to 1981 for damages for this industry, for this aluminum plant, because it was the 1960s that there was the TL Mountain became denuded of trees because of the floral emissions and the cattle and the grass and the gardens in the area that were affected by those emissions. And I'd say that CFAC is getting, and are getting off really easy. I just happen to go back to 1980.
So, the comment is that, it's a shame that the, damages only go back to 1981. And I just want to be sure that it's clear that, releases that occurred prior to 1981, but where there's a continuing injuries, the injury still gets assessed as part of the, like if it's continuing to spread through the environment and you're continuing to have an injury to the environment, it's just, we're not looking at, for example, if you're saying that the groundwater may have been contaminated in 1970, we're not recovering for the public's inability to drink that groundwater from 1970 to 1981. But the groundwater is still contaminated now. So there's still damages that can be recovered for what's there now. It's just the past losses prior to 1981. If it makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's close. I'm just add a little bit of detail of those equivalency analyses that I was talking about when we look at like what's the volume of groundwater that's been impacted, and we look at how long has it been impacted, and so we could say we have like 100 acre feet of contaminated groundwater, and it's been contaminated since 1955. Will be, let's say the remedy takes 20 years into 2065. So we look at that whole time period and look building on what Kathy said. For the damages we assess, we have to start at 1981. So it shaves off a little bit of that beginning. But yeah, that baseline condition is set before the hazardous substance release.
So you're saying that vegetation in the area, Kettle Mountain, etc., that was killed in the 1960s. Okay, you got your baseline, killed in the 1960s, but it takes 100 years to get back to your baseline. Then the time from 1981 to 100 years will be assessed.
Yeah, if it were to have been a release in 1955 and everything being fully recovered by 1980, we wouldn't be able to do anything. But if it takes 100 years, that is something we're looking at.
So I don't know if I have ever seen in any of the EPA DEQ documents any reference to the vegetation. So I guess I didn't put that in my public comments.
Yeah, and just to, I guess, add on to that, the comment was we haven't seen any reference to vegetation in EPA or DEQ documents, and just back to the different jobs of remedy and restoration. You know, remedy is really forward looking and preventing risk into the future. NRD, natural resource damage, we're looking into the past too. And so we look at a lot more data as far as, you know, what was it like in 1981, 82, 83. So we will probably be looking at things that EPA and DEQ are not looking at as pictures. Thank you.
We try a little bit to what she was saying. Here's some teeth from Cal. I don't know, year 1916.
It was the late 1960s.
Okay. And you guys have something in your document that said that the aluminum plants putting up fluoride all the way to 10,000 pounds a day. Then the truth of that was in the late 60s, the aluminum plant, several lawsuits that would have even settlements for pulling the law. And then, but the one that in the late 60s, they built 3 power plants. And the ambition that they used to measure it by onto the building with the fluoride going on. We're trying to produce. In those days, those numbers were like 1,000 and 1,200 tons per ton, produce 50,000 tons times 1,200. It's like 6 million tons of chloride per day. If burned to kettle metal, it just destroyed every tree on the side heading on the rivers. And they blamed it because the state was curious that was following it. You know, they came back, didn't do anything about it, but you know, problem, what's going on there? Finding, okay. And at the same time, you'll notice there's things starting in the Glacier Park with damage to trees in the park. He did the work of the park for probably 20 years for sampling trees and grasses and evaluating the fluoride. There's so much fluoride that's put out of that plant. Like a 3-4 year period where it killed everything. There's cattle, birds were parked down here the other side of the river somewhere.
South of Highway 2.
South of Highway 2 location, they got that way. So the wind's northern from the west, so that's why it destroyed T-Cap alone. Destroyed their farm. The plant got out of it by neighbors' properties for 1960 something prices. Managed their neighbor. His family was one of them. They are the farthest north piece of property. It's 168 homestead. They sold it to the company for $50,000. I was working there in 1996. They sold it to a Californian for 1.18 million. Yeah, that's a kind of rip off that company. They put on people over the years. And that was the blessing of the church that they did. They deserve to pay for their Latin community friendly business.
So the comment was, information on how much fluoride was released. We'd love to have that kind of comment made to us here. If you have information that would help with some of, calculating how much, the contaminant pathway and how much was released. So the comment was on, settlements that were made by the company, related to both buying private property. I alluded to some cow, teeth. I'm assuming they had fluoride or something in his teeth. You would love to see it. But I know it's not cool, but I do find it interesting to see the chemistry of that. And some blue bones for one of my sites that worked on. So then you also noted that there were a number of settlements with the U.S. government and investigations related to the Forest Service settlement that we cited in the assessment plan. That's obviously something you have to take into consideration. You referenced the studies that were done in Glacier and the fluoride impacts there. It's there's a lot of historic information on it, and we did try to compile as much as we could. That would be one thing we would definitely welcome. If you think that there's a source of historic information that we missed in the assessment plan, we would love that.
What told there's fluoride in Flathead River in 1984. State waited until 1981 to finally look at it. Back to the state and tell them it's been competent since now we've been irresponsible. I mean, realistic. Yeah. They let it go into the river and did nothing. And then after 1991, we did studies, but did we do anything to take the fluoride out of the Flathead River? No. And it's still going down there. And they say, well, how long is it going to go down there? No, we're talking 10, 20, 30, 40 years. How about 200, maybe even 500 years. It'd still be 100 because stuff that's buried up there is in significant volumes of and multiple smells that, you guys said there's 8 ounces actually in 9. And they would be careful in the EPA's document to talk about how they're all capped. And when they start out with the only one dump, it has a cap on the top and a cap on the bottom. The other 8 have nothing on the bottom. Most of them do not have. But people today would say is an adequate cap to stop water. There's studies showing that the water's coming up underground. There's several of the dumps that are getting a daily fall and spring. up and down. You know, those dogs are gonna run that kind of crap for years. Not years as in 10 years, as in decades or centuries because of it. So, you know, this is a lot of deputy in the long run, but how do you assess it in today's times? Because they're not doing anything to solve it. Their solution is let Mother Nature take care of problems in there. Take your 500 years, something with it. Kind of not good for the residents. For government agency, I guess that's. Definitely.
So, the comment was that there's been continuing sources of fluoride and powder and other contamination to the river. And what I think most important that we want to emphasize to everyone in this room is we really would welcome any source of historic information that you have that you think we missed. We would like to, that would, we are not intentionally trying to avoid looking at information that's out there. We did what we thought was a comprehensive job. So if there's more information, we would love to get it. That a little more important things that we would like to get in a comment. If you think we've missed something, please let us know. We are not locked in on thinking that this is an iterative process.
You don't have the information on the impact, the staff, the solution for information.
We do have that, yeah. I think we started it.
Yeah, the question was if we have data on the stipulation part. I think we studied some studies from 70s on the impacts of fire on fish. I'm not sure about teeth.
Yeah, if you have studies on teeth, we would take it. I mean, we really did try to put references to what we had. So if you have information that you don't think we have, you don't. And we did try, but it's just at the assessment plan phase. So it's not intended to be comprehensive. At this point.
Are you gonna do a presentation on like the content at some point?
On the report itself?
On, and just even like on what the plan is, like. I understand at this point, we just have to read it. But that's a hard way to
I
get all this stuff.
So this was a struggle. The question was if we're gonna give a presentation on what's in the plan. I will blame myself for that. Cindy had more detail. We just were struck. I actually asked, is this too much of the meeting? I think she would be happy to answer any specific questions you have about the plan. If you want information about like what we looked, I mean, we looked at everything that we were aware, EPA documents, the Forest Service litigation, the glacier, the DEQ violations, the lawsuit between Atlantic Richfield and Columbia Falls and Oil Company that went up to the Ninth Circuit. Like, we really did try to cast a wide net and then identify sources of information.
Water monitoring in the park.
The one ongoing
Water monitoring
In the park, yeah.
Basically, I just think the Park Service is not involved in the assessment, I think you are, like, certain spots.
It's, I think USGS data should be open source.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we've looked at it because GS monitoring.
Yeah, I don't think so, but we certainly will. We're covering other sites, so.
Okay.
So it would be really great if you would come back again, and do another public presentation when, when you get planned. And that's kind of what we were asking. You have to read this.
Sounds like I do because the comments are due July 23rd, so.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would encourage you to, we tried to get to the important purposes, there's more like in the weeds stuff. But I would encourage you to read it. I mean, it's long, but it's too long. If you stick to the main text, it's a lot of that. But I just want to throw out, like, I'm happy to take calls, emails, whatever, if there are things that don't make sense, like, call me and I'm happy to give you more information.
Yeah, and to answer your question, will we come back and do future public meetings? Yes, absolutely. We don't have any ability to make anyone do anything, I mean, other than like litigating with the responsible parties, but ultimately when we have to have community partners, like we need not just to be able to do the assessment well, but to actually be able to implement restoration if we get, if we are able to get a settlement or, court order, we need partners in the community, so we give a bit back, yeah, absolutely, when we have the assessment, and we are, like Cindy said, she'll answer any questions about what is in the plan. I mean, ultimately, the first step is going to be looking at all of the data that's out there and trying to figure out if we have enough information, like Nadia said, with the data and reasonable assumptions that we can basically quantify the injury and figure out damages based on existing data. Because that's ultimately the goal, is to try to move quickly to getting a dollar figure in settlement so you can implement restoration. Like, spending a lot of time trying to collect additional data that we don't need, nobody wants us to do that. So that's the first step, is trying to see if we have enough information to do it with what's out there.
And if we don't have enough information and we identify data gaps that require additional data collection, we will write up another work plan that says what we're going to go out and do, and that will be publicly available as well. And if there's interest, we're happy to come back and do the meeting on that.
You had one slide that indicated all the abuse, like 14, and then 3 more organic compounds. Are you just increasing those?
So the question was, we have a slide on all of the contaminants and are testing for all of those. We, right now, we don't have any primary data collection planned. Right now, we're just going to look at what has already been collected. And I think those made our list because they've already been sampled for. And then if we don't have enough information to understand the injury fully, we might go out and collect more data. I would say that that's a preliminary list, based on kind of a rapid review of the existing data. So it could change. It could get bigger or smaller, we'll to see. So that.
Would it be fair to say that you are somewhat dependent, substantially, on the ability of other agencies to, so who have promised to collect data? That they can transport them or give them speed.
Yeah, so the question is, are we dependent on other agencies like DEQ collecting additional data and sharing it with us? And yeah, I mean, I think we have a responsibility, I guess, both sides, revenue and restoration, to work together as much as we can and try not to duplicate efforts. So we try to really work with DEQ and EPA and make sure that data collection efforts are meeting both their needs for the cleanup and our needs for sustainability. And maybe share data as well. Yeah, we have the site data right now in the database. And yeah, our hope is that moving forward, we'll continue to get data as well.
Are we enjoying?
So that's what we're doing. And we don't try to find out. Oh, yeah, did you better? So the
No.
You see where it's a billion total. Maybe it's just a fun, good time of day. But almost. I needed. They needed to come up with it. Which one? This is.
So we had a final question on the waste that was disposed of from the site to the landfill, and I don't know enough information about that to be able to answer it.
This is the problem for me because I pay for it. And, what's it? Company, it's like the whole thing.
So, we don't know the answer to that question. I would suspect it probably is not, would not factor into our assessment, but I would certainly be willing to think about it and follow up further. But if they paid tipping fees and it was done in compliance with the law, we likely not there. So I appreciate you coming and thank you everyone online where, as you can see, we're ending the meeting. So thank you again, everyone, for your time.
If you want information.